Trouble was looming on the horizon. Joe Gaudet had been anticipating it for a while now. He started slowing down his activities, always keeping an eye on the approaching storm clouds. The housing market was in chaos. People who didn't qualify for home loans were being granted them. People who couldn't afford their monthly payments were given loans with false limitations. As soon as their interest rates increased to their actual value, those people would go from paying a few $100s a month to being responsible for over $1,000 a month. It was impossible for them to keep up with those skyrocketing payments. In Degard, Louisiana, there were more home buyers than sellers. Houses were being built rapidly, and they were being snatched up before they were even finished. Joe knew that this frantic pace couldn't last forever. Not only were there storm clouds in the housing market and the political arena in the spring of 2008, but there were also storm clouds brewing in his own home. As the CFO of St. Elizabeth's water sewage, Joe pulled into the driveway of the modest home he shared with his wife Gretchen and her two daughters, Glenda and Gertrude Longlinnays. The house was made of grayish-white brick with dark forest green trim. The overhangs, gutters, front door, and faux wooden shutters were all painted forest green. The garage door, on the other hand, was stark white to tie everything together. Leave it to a woman to come up with that stuff. Joe muttered as he parked his car to the side of the driveway, leaving space for Gretchen to park her minivan in the garage. Although it was a two-car garage, Joe's side was occupied by his Harley-Davidson Fat Boy. A small walkway led from the driveway to the front door, with a grayish-white brick flower box between the walkway and the exterior wall of the home. When Joe and Gretchen had bought the house, the flower box was empty, filled only with dirt. But now, there were flowers planted in it, brightening up the home from the outside. Inside, however, things weren't as bright. Gretchen had been becoming increasingly dissatisfied for reasons she wouldn't disclose. Glenda, 13 years old, and Gertrude, nicknamed Rudy, 11 years old, were constant sources of irritation to Joe. They often reminded him that he wasn't their father, making it clear that they didn't have to listen to him. However, they had no problem coming to him when they wanted something. When Joe and Gretchen had first gotten together, she had asked if he would consider adopting her daughters. "What? Gretchen, they already have a father," Joe had reminded her. "I won't take any child away from their father." Joe's first wife, Vicky, had done exactly that to him. She had met and run away with a man from Colombia, taking their son Jay with her. Even after 9 years and spending thousands of dollars, Joe had yet to see his son again. David Longlinnays may be a jerk, but he's still their father, Joe had said. Standing in front of the house, Joe looked at the flowers once more, shaking his head. He reached into his pocket for his keys and opened the screen door. "Joe? Hey, Joe?" a man called out. Joe turned around and saw a heavily overweight man waddling towards him, sweat pouring down his face. The man was wearing a cheap suit that was drenched in sweat. "Damn, it's hot out here, huh?" The man wheezed as he approached Joe. "Yeah, and it's not even June yet," Joe agreed. "And you've been served," Reynolds said, handing Joe a manila envelope. "What a surprise," Joe said sarcastically. "Sorry, Joe, it's just my job," Reynolds shrugged. "No, you probably don't remember. You did the same thing 9 years ago when my wife Vicky left the country," Joe said. "Oh, I'm sorry," Reynolds said, looking uncomfortable. Joe didn't respond. He just unlocked the door to his house and stepped inside. "Son of a gun," he bellowed upon seeing the empty living room. The kitchen was also bare, devoid of any furniture. Even the den, Joe's home office, had been stripped clean. Joe checked the closet and noticed markings where someone had tried to pry it open. He sighed in relief when he found that the file cabinet was still inside and the drawers were untouched. The safe on top of the cabinet was also intact. He quickly spun the dial and let out a sigh of relief. Locking the closet securely, Joe continued to inspect the rest of the house. The bedrooms, both Glenda and Gertrude's, were empty. The master bedroom was in the same state, bare except for the suit still in the closet. However, his jeans and socks were scattered on the floor. Then Joe returned to the closet one more time. His gun safe was missing. He mentally berated himself for not bolting it down to the concrete floor as the contractor had suggested. It had taken 4 men to get the bulky safe into the closet. Joe didn't think anyone would be able to remove it easily. "A disgruntled wife, huh? That's a different story," Joe muttered to himself while looking at the depression the safe had made in the carpet. Joe went back to the kitchen to look at the envelope Reynolds had given him. "Kenneth Progene," he muttered. "Jesse Johnson's office, Terry Broussard. Jesse Johnson's latest assistant said. "Can I speak to Jesse Johnson, please?" "This is Joe Gaudet," Joe said. "And who may I say is calling?" Terry inquired. "Joe Gaudet," Joe repeated. Jesse didn't hire assistants for their intelligence, but for their physical appearance. He often joked that he was more impressed by their ability to handle difficult situations rather than their typing skills. "Jesse speaking," Jesse said. "Jesse, it's Joe," Joe said. "Gretchen filed for divorce, and I came home to an empty house." Joe described the state of the house, then had a sudden realization. He ran to the garage and screamed in anger when he saw that his Harley's cover was on the ground, but his bike was missing. "Is Kenneth representing her?" Jesse asked, almost gleefully. Joe called the police to report the thefts and also let them know who he suspected was responsible. There was a guy down the street who did the same thing once one officer told his partner as they walked around the house. Found out his wife was cheating on him, so he burned the house down. "I remember that," the partner said. The guy just stood there, holding his cat in a carrier, watching the house go up in flames. "Let's hope Gretchen doesn't get any ideas," Joe commented dryly. Since it was already late on Friday afternoon, there wasn't much that could be done. With no furniture to sleep on and without his favorite pillow, Joe packed some clothes into a garbage bag, secured the front and back doors, and set the alarm system. He left the house through the garage door and changed the code before closing it. "She'll never figure this out," Joe chuckled dryly as he punched in the current date as the new code. Walking into the DeGard Inn with a garbage bag was nothing new to the clerk. Men with frustrated expressions asking for a room was a common occurrence as well. The clerk refrained from asking, "Did she turn the sprinklers on after throwing your clothes in the front yard?" Professional decorum also kept her from smirking when his debit card was declined. She simply informed him that his card had been declined. Of course, Joe spat out as he handed her his American Express card. "May I see some ID?" she politely asked. Very well, Joe praised her and showed her his driver's license. On Monday morning, Jesse Johnson was in court, armed with the police report and a folder full of Joe's receipts for the stolen items. Judge Stephen Hill ruled in Joe's favor, stating that Joe was the rightful owner of the furniture and that it should be returned to him in the condition it was in when it was taken. Kenneth Prejean did his best to delay the proceedings, but Jesse's client came out on top. "Come on, Joe, let's go get your stuff," Jesse said. Joe rented a U-Haul truck and hired 3 of his employees to help. They followed the same 2 police officers from the previous Friday evening. "I should have known," Joe said as they pulled up to Keith Blanchard's house. Keith Blanchard had started as a painter for Scanduro Construction. He even briefly dated Anna Scanduro, the daughter of the company's owner. After Tony Clark broke Dan Scanduro's monopoly in St. Elizabeth Parish, Keith began working for Clark International. In a matter of months, he became a project supervisor, leading teams of up to 20 men. Eventually, Keith branched out on his own. He worked quickly and cheaply, just like the Scanduros, but his work was often subpar. Keith had approached First Union Bank hoping to secure a loan to develop a condominium complex, but Joe, along with 2 other board members, rejected the proposal. They saw the same storm clouds Joe had been warning about and were also aware of Keith's shoddy craftsmanship. Joe cast the deciding vote against Keith Blanchard's condominium project. The looks Keith and his brother Kevin, as well as their attorney, Kenneth Prejean, shot at Joe could have killed him multiple times over. Now, pulling up to the man's home, Joe felt sick to his stomach. His bike was in front of the house, and it looked as if it had been run over by Keith's 3/4-ton pickup truck. "Half of this stuff is mine," Gretchen screamed as she came charging out of the house. "But you had no right to remove any of it from the marital home until a division of assets decision's been reached," Jesse Johnson intoned. "But it's mine." "I picked it all out," she screamed, trying to reach Joe. "Ma am, calm down, I don't want to have to arrest you, Ma am," one of the police officers implored. "Ma am, your children are right there. They're watching you," the other police officer stated firmly. "You really want them seeing their mom behaving like a wild woman?" "Hi, mister. Joe, like what we done to your bike?" Rudy Longlinay smirked. "Shh wasn't supposed to say nothing," Glenda reminded her younger sister. "You broke it, you buy it," Joe said to a slightly more composed Gretchen. The furniture that had come out of the marital home was ruined. Urine stained the couch cushions, and Joe's favorite leather recliner and leather office chair had been slashed and someone had defecated on them. "Don't know what I ever did, but..." Joe muttered. "Oh right," Gretchen snarled angrily. "You know what you done." Keith told me all about it. His desk drawers were empty. Gretchen claimed ignorance of where his paperwork, the photographs he had of his son, the photographs he had of his parents had disappeared to. Someone had taken a sharp tool and savagely ripped the bottom drawer out, snapping the lock. Joe had kept those few precious photographs in that drawer. Gosh darn. He actually sobbed, seeing his grandfather's desk so mangled. Key was right there in the middle drawer. Oops, Gretchen smirked. Is there anyone can watch your kids? One police officer asked. What? Why? Gretchen asked. Because we're placing you under arrest, the man said. The whole time, Joe had noticed that Keith Blanchard was absent. Jesse noticed this as well, called his office and had one of his associates go to Judge Stephen Hill's chambers to file a warrant for Keith Blanchard's arrest. Joe stoically pulled his cell phone out and hit a number. Hi, David? Hi, it's Joe, Joe said. Over Gretchen's screamed protests, Joe told Glenda and Rudy's father where his 2 girls were. So his U-Haul and his 3 hired laborers were put to use. Joe had them take the furniture he'd bought for the 2 girls out of Keith Blanchard's home and bring the furniture to David's trailer. I don't know what I ever did to get you 2 girls so angry with me, Joe told the 2 still smirking girls. But I do love you. You were hanging out with that guy, mister. Keith told us, Glenda smirked. And we don't love you, Rudy snapped. We hate you. What? I wasn't. I never. Joe protested. Gretchen called Kenneth Progene from the DeGard Police Department. Kenneth did remind Gretchen that he was Keith Blanchard's attorney, Keith Blanchard's legal representation. Well, I'll pay you, Gretchen said. With what, Mrs. Gaudette? Kenneth asked. Mr. Gaudette's attorney had your accounts frozen. David Longlinnays looked at the caller ID on his landline telephone. Thanks to his last girlfriend, a dancer at Club Fantastics, he recognized the number of the DeGard, the Bender, and the Kimball police departments. Yellow, he asked, hoping it might just be Trish calling for help. David, listen. This is Gretchen, Gretchen pleaded. Listen, please, I need a little help here. She screamed in outrage when the telephone went dead. Joe did not recognize the number and answered. You are kidding me. This is a joke, right? This has got to be a joke, he interrupted Gretchen's plea. No, Joe, it's no joke, Gretchen whined, then switched to a cooing voice. I mean, I'm in trouble, and you? Well, you're always so good at knowing just what to do. And I know just what to do now, Joe said firmly. Oh yeah? Gretchen said back, then squealed in indignation when Joe disconnected the call. Keith evaded detection for a week. But finally, he forgot and used a credit card to pay for gas. That signaled the DeGard Police Department of his whereabouts. 20 minutes later, 2 policemen, wearing the khaki uniforms of the Oakleaf, Texas Police Department, showed up at Keith Blanchard's motel room. 19 hours later, he was in front of a judge in Oakleaf County. 19 hours and 34 minutes later, he was in the rear of a DeGard Police Department cruiser. 43 hours after being picked up by the Oakleaf PD, Keith Blanchard was arraigned. Bail was set at $100,000, and he bonded out. And Gretchen Gaudette's looking at some pretty serious charges. Kenneth Progene said as he and Keith Blanchard got comfortable in Kenneth's office. So? Forget her, Keith snapped. Thought you did, Kevin Blanchard guffawed. Know the problem with pretty women? Keith said, even as Kenneth's personal assistant brought in 2 cups of coffee and 1 bottle of water. They think just hanging out and letting you have a good time should be good enough. The woman almost retorted in defense of women. Instead, she bit her tongue and left the room. And the problem with men is they don't know how to treat a woman. She snarled under her breath when the office door closed. Kenneth Progene was able to get all of the charges against Keith dropped down to misdemeanors, vandalism of property. Keith was also ordered to pay restitution for Joe's Harley-Davidson. Kenneth was also able to do the same for Gretchen Gaudette. The attractive blonde looked around as they stepped outside of the courthouse. Then she looked at Kenneth. So what do I do now? She asked. Now? I suppose we need to see about that divorce. You still want that divorce, right? Kenneth asked. Yeah, I guess. He was cheating on me. I'm not about to put up with that, Gretchen said. But I mean, where's Keith think he's taking care of some business DeGard National Bank got him the financing First Union didn't want give him? Kenneth shrugged. Kenneth resolved he'd charge Gretchen and Keith an additional service hour for having to drive Gretchen to Keith's home. And when Keith arrived home, he was not happy in the least to see Gretchen sitting on his couch. What are you doing here? He snarled. Kenneth got the charges reduced, she said, puzzled at his angry outburst. No, no, dummy. I mean, what the heck are you doing here? In my house, he demanded loudly. I live here now, remember? Gretchen said, confused. And what happened to, where's all my clothes? What the heck do you think? He snorted. You and your silly little friends are out of here. All your stuff is at that guy's trailer. Joe doesn't. Wait, David? You gave my stuff to David, Gretchen asked, voice rising. No, don't be getting all loud and stuff, Keith said. Need to get out of my house. But, I live here, Gretchen protested. What part of no, you don't is confusing you? Keith roared. He reached over the coffee table and yanked her to her feet. Then he pushed her toward his front door. Gretchen grabbed her cell phone and purse and made her way to the front door. She wasn't moving fast enough for Keith, so he helped her by shoving her again. Hi, Gretchen, David said when he answered his phone. Girls aren't here, their bus doesn't drop them off until about 4. David, I need. Gretchen started. Man, why is it always about what you need? David interrupted. Oh, and Saint. Richard's asking about next year's tuition. Oh, and Saint. Thomas is asking if Glenda's going to be going there next year. Darn, Gretchen said. The girls had been in Andrew Jackson Elementary School when she and Joe had started dating. Joe had managed to get the girls transferred over to St. Richard's. The girls loved that school, loved their teachers, their friends. But unless Joe paid their tuition, they'd have no choice but to transfer Gertrude back to Andrew Jackson, and Glenda would be starting at Northside High School. Still there? David asked. Yeah, Gretchen said, sitting down on Keith's front step. The sandals with their 4-inch heels were not conducive for walking. It was at least 3 miles to Joe's house and 5, almost 6 miles to David's trailer. She had no idea where her minivan was. She'd checked Keith's garage when she'd let herself in earlier that day. So you got my clothes and stuff? She listlessly asked. Yeah, goodness gracious, that's a bunch of stuff, huh? David asked. 5 suitcases and 3 boxes. Why do you need all that stuff? How about my minivan? She asked. One Joe paid for. One Joe has the title to. David cheerfully asked. Darn, Gretchen said again. Guess there's no way you'd come and get me, huh? Sure, David chuckled. Soon as them Saints win the Super Bowl. She checked her wallet again. Again, there was only $9 in cash, $11.14 if she counted her change. She stood up and rang Keith's doorbell. There was no answer. Then she took the house key out and unlocked his door. He was in the shower. Through the open door, Gretchen could see Keith dancing in the shower. His wallet was on his dresser, so Gretchen helped herself to a few $100 bills. Then she walked downstairs and left again. Should have taken the key back, goofball she thought as she punched in the number for Rapid's cabs. Rapid Cabs sent out a surly driver and she gave him David's address. That trailer park off Tarragona? He asked. Use date this girl lived there. Marjorie, oh dang, what was her name? David wasn't thrilled to see his ex-wife, but Glenda and Gertrude were there, so he was civil to her. He did remind her, being civil was a lot more than she'd ever done for him. Glenda and Gertrude were thrilled to see their mother. They'd missed her, they'd missed the comfort of Mr. Joe's home, of Mr. Keith's home. Some of the children on bus 114 actually made fun of them for being dropped off in front of a trailer park. And Daddy's too rough when he brushes my hair, Rudy complained. Well, maybe if you didn't have so much of it, David said easily as he playfully tugged the girl's long red hair. Daddy, quit, Rudy demanded. Gretchen complained about David's dinner of fried chicken and mashed potatoes. Know how many carbs are in that? She whined. Know how many of us care? He whined back. He pointed to the stove. Anytime you feel like bouncing off of that jiggly bottom of yours and doing it? You cook dinner, he offered. I'm sure your skills in the kitchen have improved vastly since you last lived here, right? My bottom is not jiggly, maybe you should look in a mirror lately? She hissed. Mom, we like his fried chicken, Glenda offered. Whatever, it's not good for you, Gretchen complained. And neither is starving to death, David said. Boy, would that just mess up your whole day, huh? David asked Glenda and she giggled. Dinner out of the way, Gretchen sat and waited. David sat and stared at her. Finally, he waved his arm, indicating the kitchen table. Girls need the table to do their homework, he said. Okay, Gretchen said, not understanding. Tables don't clean themselves, Gretchen, he said. Gretchen did clean the table. She did so with much jostling, slapping, smacking of things. David's plates and cups were durable plastic, though, so she just managed to make noise. The girls don't have their own rooms. Glenda snapped at the girls sat at the table. Of course they do, but they're in their rooms. How am I supposed to help them? David asked as he and Glenda looked at her arithmetic textbook. Fine, I'm tired, Gretchen said. Okay, good night, David said. So which room is mine? Gretchen asked. The living room is right there, David said. After noisily helping the girls with their homework, David loudly wished them a good night and retired to his own room. In the morning, David noisily roused the girls and loudly prepared their breakfast. Oh my gosh, Gretchen complained, head pounding, body stiff. Then she saw their breakfast, biscuits, hash browns, bacon. Oh my goodness, David, they're going to be dropping dead of heart attacks before they're 20, Gretchen complained. But they'll be happy, David shrugged. After the girls left, after Gretchen had brushed Rudy's long red hair and Glenda had brushed her own long blonde hair, David told Gretchen she had 3 days find herself a place to live. We're divorced, you up and walked out on me, told me see you, loser, and dragged my girls with you, David snarled, obviously still quite angry over the bitter divorce. Not a court out there can make me help you, and I'm not about to start now. What about Glenda and Rudy? Gretchen snarled. Oh no, they're fine. They're just fine right here, David laughed a bitter laugh. They're taken care of. It's your belly you need be worrying about. David readied for another day at the Baggett mattress factory and left the trailer. On his lunch break, David did call Joe Gaudet. Joe, I don't know how long it'll take me, but I will pay you back, he promised. Glenda and Rudy really love Saint. Richard and Glenda's fixing go to Saint Thomas next year. Okay, Joe said. That's it, David laughed, relief flooding over him. You not going make me beg? I'll drop off the check, heck. I'm not doing anything right now, Joe said. I'll go do it now. Thank you, and I promise you, I will pay you back, David declared. When you can, Joe said. David repeated his assertion to Gretchen when he came home. She had 3 days, 2 days now, to find herself a new couch to sleep on. Then he busied himself making another carbohydrate and grease-laden meal. On the morning of the last day, Gretchen said she'd be moving in with her sister and her sister's life partner, because Stacy and Gina lived in Elgin, Louisiana, outside of St. Richard's district, and because Aunt Stacy and Gina did not want them, Glenda and Rudy would not be coming with her. That's fine, already took care of next year's tuition anyway, David shrugged. You have enough money, Gretchen sputtered, outraged. And I only been getting $500 a month child support. Life's challenging, huh? David smirked. Oh, and since they living here now, you ain't getting that $500 a month neither. The Republican and Democratic conventions were televised, promises made, accusations made. As far as Joe Gaudet was concerned, neither candidate had the necessary skills to be commander-in-chief, but he didn't care for any of the third-party candidates either. By mid-August, he just wanted the election to be over, and he just wanted his divorce to be over. Paul Robichaud had done a beautiful job of restoring Joe's grandfather's desk. Because Joe knew the damaged and replaced areas, he could see the repairs. But the casual observer would never be able to tell what 93-year-old wood was and what brand new wood was. The gun safe had been returned to Joe's closet and was now securely bolted to the floor. Paul Robichaud had assured Joe that it would take a backhoe to get that safe out of the house. But every time Joe walked past the flower box in front of the house, he wanted to take a backhoe and empty the cheerful garden. He contented himself with spitting on Gretchen's flowers. His insurance company had declared his Harley Fat Boy a complete loss and had paid it off. Joe replaced it with a lowrider Fat Boy. He actually preferred the newer bike to his old one, but Joe would never admit that to Gretchen. By the end of August, DeGard National Bank saw why First Union, more specifically, Joe Gaudet, had declined approval of Keith's proposed condominium complex. St. Elizabeth Parish's president, Chad Mintz, had appointed Scott Collins as engineering city inspector. Scott Collins took his job very seriously. The foundation, nearly 6 acres worth of concrete, had to be torn up and formed and poured again to meet both parish and state specifications. Rather than simply pour a slab that would meet specs, Keith, or Kevin, had decided to shave 2 inches off of the depth of the foundation. Scott Collins actually used a standard school-issue plastic ruler, noticed the discrepancy, and made them tear out the second foundation. The plumbing was also less than adequate, and the city inspector refused to approve the plumbing until the pipes were changed. Since the new pipes put them several $1,000s over budget, Keith, or Kevin, decided to shave a few dollars off of the electrical wiring. Once again, The diligent city inspector caught the substitution, and several $100s worth of wiring wound up on the scrap heap. By the time, already 2 months behind schedule, the first piece of sheetrock was hung, Blanchard Construction stood to lose nearly $100,000, even if every unit built was purchased at full market price. DeGard National Bank stood to lose nearly that much. Then banks began to collapse nationwide. Corporations began to fail. Mortgage holders began to try to call in owed money, tried to stay solvent, tried to stay afloat. DeGard National Bank, in a severe financial pinch, halted construction of Stonecrest condominiums. In the midst of the upheaval, Joe and Gretchen Gaudet appeared before Judge Harold Monroe in Gaudet v. Gaudet. "Good morning, Mrs. Gaudet, or have you resumed using Longlinnays or Hebert or Simon as your last name?" Jessie asked politely. "I've returned to my maiden name of Lampkin," she icily answered. Jessie smirked. Kenneth obviously had not known of Gretchen's previous marriages. He then questioned Gretchen about her claims that Joe Gaudet had been having an affair with Ebony Hinton. "Keith told me," Gretchen snapped. Jessie whispered to one of his junior associates. The young man nodded and scampered out of the courtroom. "And exactly who is this Ebony Hinton?" Jessie asked. "Keith said she's a dancer down at that sleazy, oh goodness, what's the name of that place?" "Mickey's. Out in Kimball," Gretchen said. "But you've never actually seen this woman?" Jessie asked. "No, like I need to see some lady of the night?" Gretchen spat. "And you've never seen Joe Gaudet with this woman?" Jessie asked. "No," Gretchen snapped. "So you've never seen this supposed friendship?" Jessie pressed. "Objection," asked and answered. Kenneth said. "Mr. Pregine, this is a civil case, not a criminal case." Judge Monroe chided the man. "But since it is your client that is making the allegations of betrayal, I'll allow the line of questioning." "Mr. Johnson, proceed, but I'm finished with that line of questioning, Your Honor." Jessie smiled. "Break for lunch," Kenneth suggested. "Very well," Harold agreed, banging his gavel. "You even know this Ebony Hinton?" Jessie asked his client. "I don't even know." Mickey Joe denied. When they returned from lunch, Jessie had 6 African-American women sitting directly behind Joe's table. All 6 looked bored, annoyed, inconvenienced. Gretchen was again called to the stand, and Jessie questioned her about the destruction of Joe's property, the draining of his bank account, the maxing out of their jointly held credit cards. "Nothing further, Your Honor," Jessie said. "But we'd like to call Keith Blanchard to the stand." Keith glared raw hatred at Joe Gaudet. His glare toward Gretchen wasn't much friendlier. Jessie greeted the man, asked him his occupation, asked him his relation to either party in the divorce. Then he asked Keith to point out which one of the 6 women was Ebony Hinton. "You don't know?" Gretchen screamed as Keith looked stricken. "You jerk. You don't know." She collapsed at the table, finally realizing that she'd been fooled by a man that despised her husband, had done the one thing he could to hurt her husband. "Joe, oh Joe, I am so sorry," she sobbed. "Me too," Joe said. "So, want me sue Keith Blanchard?" Jessie whispered to Joe. "What a typical lawyer." Joe laughed. "Yeah, go ahead." When Judge Harold Monroe banged his gavel down on the final action of Gaudet v. Gaudet, both parties would split 50-50 all marital assets accrued during the 3 years of the union, minus the $12,658 in furniture ruined by Gretchen, the balance owed on her minivan, and the deductible of Joe's insurance on the motorcycle. "Bought the house for $79,500, Joe said to a pale Kenneth, ignoring Gretchen's sobs. "Well, appraised yesterday for $54,900. You do the math." Then he turned to the 3 African-American women that remained. "So which one of you is Ebony?" he asked. "That's me," Sugar, an attractive young woman, smiled, standing up. "Well, no wonder I had a connection with you, huh?" He smiled. "You're amazingly beautiful." "In your dreams," Sugar, the dancer, laughed. "My girlfriend's twice the man you'll ever be." "No, that's right," Joe laughed. Despite Jessie's displeasure, Joe told the attorney he would not be seeking the money from Gretchen. He knew she had returned to working at Young Insurance as an agent and was making very little money. "Hell, can't even afford her own place," Jessie Joe said. "I know you lawyers can get blood from a stone, but let this one go, huh?" Fine, fine. But you do still want to proceed against Blanchard, huh?" Jessie grumbled. "Oh, absolutely," Joe said. "That guy needs to pay through the nose for this mess." "Joe, I'm sorry," Gretchen called out as they stepped into the afternoon sun. Yeah, sorry doesn't really do much, now does it?" Joe muttered to himself as he strapped his helmet on. On a whim, Joe decided to ride out to Mickey's. It was just before 4 o'clock. There was no point in going to work this late in the day. Joe recognized Kevin Blanchard's 2002 Mustang in the parking lot. I bet he's the one who gave Keith Ebony's name, Joe thought, as he decided he did not want to stop. He continued down Highway 19 until he crossed over Highway 54. There was a P.O. Boy shop in Jack's Creek that had the best catfish P.O. Boys he'd ever tasted, and he had a craving for some comfort food. The fish was piping hot, the tomato crisp, and the soda ice cold. A few dashes of hot sauce, and it was as close to heaven as Joe could hope for. 90 days, Joe thought to himself. Hell, it took us longer to find the perfect house. 90 days for the divorce to become final. In 90 days, he would become a 3-time divorcee, a 3-time loser at age 39. Joe decided to focus on the delicious sandwich, the cold beverage, and the slightly soggy French fries. 90 days. It had taken longer than that for Gretchen to find the perfect little piece of land in Baylor Lake for them to marry on. It had taken her nearly 90 days to find the perfect pale pink dress. She'd laughed so happily when she'd managed to find a pale pink tie that matched her dress exactly. He'd worn it with his solid black suit and a crisply starched white shirt. Glenda and Gertrude had looked beautiful, sweet and beautiful in their pale blue dresses. Both girls had stood, straight and solemn as their mother recited the words. "Why, I'll come back here," the old woman called out when Joe pushed away nearly half of his meal. 90 days, Joe muttered. "Sugar, are you going to make yourself wait that long?" the woman teased. Joe looked at her and gave her a sad smile before strapping his helmet on. Returning home, Joe parked the Harley in his garage. He closed the garage door and entered the house through the kitchen door, rather than walk by the flowers. Some were beginning to droop, others showed definite signs of death. The message light on his answering machine blinked and Joe pressed the button. "Joe, oh Joe, I can't believe, oh God," Gretchen wailed. Joe pressed the pause button and looked. The digital display said the message was 5 minutes long, the maximum amount of time the digital recorder allotted. He deleted the message. "Joe, I know saying I'm sorry, well, I guess it's too late for that," Gretchen's voice sobbed and sniffled. Joe saw that this message was also 5 minutes long and deleted it. The third message was 21 seconds long. It was from Mitzi, his personal assistant, reminding him of the board meeting scheduled for the following morning. Good girl, Joe smiled softly. "That's why I pay you the little bucks." Gretchen's third message was only 4 minutes and 9 seconds long, but Joe deleted it as well. "What is it about me?" Joe asked himself as he wearily sat down on his new couch. Gretchen would have absolutely hated the new couch. It was a deep blue, a plush material, but Joe liked the way it looked with the sand-colored rug. His tan and blue recliner matched the couch as well as the carpet. He kicked his shoes off and stretched out on the new couch, clicked the remote on, and the LCD screen flickered to life. "What is it about me, huh?" he asked himself again. Vicky had started a relationship with Ricky Ricardo, as Joe called her Colombian friend. Bad enough she'd been involved with someone else behind his back, but then she stole his money, and worse yet, his only child, and flew away. Angela Huval had been a sweet-faced pixie that had lived next door to them. She'd babysat their child when he and Vicky went on dates. When Vicky ran off, Angela came over and comforted Joe. She confessed she'd always had a bit of a crush on him. 15 months after Vicky's departure, Angela and Joe were married. At least she didn't drain the bank account, Joe muttered, not seeing the news on the television. Her old high school sweetheart had come back into town. Joe later found out the reason Dwayne had been out of town was his 4-year stint as a guest of the Arkansas penal system. Dwayne wanted to fight. Joe shrugged and told Dwayne there was nothing to fight over. "She's stupid enough to run off with you?" Joe had said. "I'm smart enough to let her." Angela would not let it go and persuaded Dwayne into fighting Joe. Joe did wonder at his own foolishness in falling in love with a girl barely out of high school. Dwayne threw the first punch. Joe stepped under the punch and beat the hulking brute until the young man wet himself. Last Joe heard, Dwayne was serving a 12 to 20-year sentence and Angela had 3 children and was living with her parents again. Gretchen, he was certain, would be forever. They would grow old together, playing with their grandchildren. She was no child at the age of 31, and as an insurance agent, seemed to have some smarts. With a sigh, he turned off the television and went to bed. The new curtains in his bedroom did block out the sunlight. It wasn't even 7 o'clock yet. At 5:30 the next morning, He woke up and wearily thought of his day ahead. If it had not been for the board meeting that morning, Joe would have called in sick. Instead, he made a pot of coffee, then fried a couple of slices of thick-cut bacon. In the bacon grease, he fried 3 eggs. Joe smiled. He could actually hear Gretchen's voice complaining about fat and cholesterol. Sitting down to enjoy his breakfast, he saw that the message light was blinking again. "Hi, Mr. Joe. This is Glenda," Glenda's voice said. I just got my first test in algebra and I made a 100. Daddy said you'd want to know." Yeah, I do," Joe smiled sadly. "Hi, Mr. Joe, 6th grade is hard." Rudy's voice chirped. "Can you believe this? My first day there they gave us homework. First day. But I'm doing okay in my classes, Daddy." "Do I need to tell him anything else? Thanks again," Joe David's voice said. "You're welcome, you're paying me back, remember?" Joe said as he chewed the thick-cut bacon. Hey, hope you're doing all right," David continued. "You ever need anything? Just let us know, okay?" 94 days later, Joe pulled a thick envelope out of the mailbox, along with a sales flyer from Abdul's department store and a few other pieces of mail. Gretchen had been an infrequent customer of the exclusive department store, so they sent sales announcements to the house. The final decree of divorce pretty much spelled out what had already been decided in Judge Harold Monroe's courtroom. Knowing it was coming and holding it in his hands were 2 different things. Joe felt a new sense of weariness overwhelm him. The election was over. Barack Obama would be the 44th president. Congress was scrambling to shore up a flagging economy and the weather was turning cold. Weeds dominated the flower box, but Joe could not force himself to care. Another letter's bright, colorful lettering caught his attention and Joe shrugged. Carnival Cruise Lines was again trying to tempt him into going on a cruise. He and Gretchen had gone on a cruise for their honeymoon, touring the U.S. Virgin Islands. Glenda and Rudy had been quite upset that they were not going. Joe had promised them the next time he and Gretchen went, they'd take them. A cold wind blew in off of the Atchafalaya Basin, and Joe shrugged again. "Why not? Why the heck not?" he said. "It ever get cold in the Bahamas?" While Joe was logging onto the Carnival Cruise Lines website, entering his promotional code, Gretchen was listlessly reading her decree of divorce. She sat at the small table in her small living room, and read the document. Her tomato basil soup got cold as she sat, just holding the papers. David had taken her to court. He was now the custodial parent. The girls were living with him, and he wanted her to pay child support, $500 a month, when most months she was lucky to clear $1,200. Her rent was $395 for a tiny 1-bedroom apartment. She had looked into a 2-bedroom apartment in the same complex, but knew she'd never be able to maintain $700 a month, not on commission sales, not when the economy was going down the drain. Pushing her cold soup aside, Gretchen got to her feet. Grabbing her purse, she stomped out of the small apartment and down the 2 flights of stairs. While Gretchen was jamming her key into the ignition of Stacy's old Kia, Keith was sitting on his couch. He sipped his apple juice and sighed. It had been several days since he'd been out of the house. There were no jobs to do. Keith glumly drank, looking over his latest stack of bills. The economy was going downhill. Most of his spec houses were sitting idle and DeGard National Bank was demanding he begin paying his loan. Even though they'd pulled the plug on his Stonecrest condominiums, they still wanted their money. Keith had driven by the shell of Stonecrest condominiums and thought about dousing the place with gasoline and dropping a match. Part of the problem with that idea was Kevin had already canceled the insurance on the property. And in the case of suspected arson, he and Kevin would be suspects number 1 and number 2. Someone had stripped all the copper wiring out of the walls. Keith was grateful to Scott Collins for making them use PVC pipes instead of the tin-coated pipes they'd originally used. The thieves would have stripped as much of that as they could. But PVC pipes had very little recycling value. Keith was dimly aware of a car coming to a stop outside of his home. His home. He'd borrowed heavily against the equity he had in the home in order to finance his other projects. He wondered when Danny would demand payment of that. The lawsuit that Joe Daudet had brought against him was also looming. Kenneth Prejean had been honest with him. It did not look good for Keith Blanchard. "I've never even heard. What the heck is slander with malice anyway?" he muttered as he took another sip of his apple juice. "What the heck?" he screamed as he heard a key in the door. "Really, Keith? I would have thought you'd have changed the locks by now," Gretchen said, beautiful face splotchy from her tears. "Jerk." "What the heck, AW, no, just get out of my house." Keith bellowed. Gretchen flung some legal papers at him. "My divorce is final, Keith," she screamed. Keith reached for her, intending to forcibly remove her from his home. The first bullet slammed into his shoulder, and he staggered back. "Oh God, no, please," he begged as Gretchen aimed for his face. She put one more bullet into his head, then put the quite hot muzzle against her own temple and squeezed the trigger. Joe Gaudet did not go on the cruise. Instead, he booked a cruise for one adult and 2 children and sent David and the girls on a Christmas cruise. The girls had, after all, suffered a horrible loss. 8 years later, 2016 Tuesday was Smothered Steak Day at the Dead End Bar. Joe Gaudet took Thomas Bergeron, the HR manager, and Brian Bro, the head of the engineering department, to the bar for a business lunch. "Summer internship coming up. I've gone over the list you gave me," Thomas Joe said, and smiled as the Asian American waitress put their plates in front of them. Born to be Wild began to blare out, and Joe saw Brian's shaved head pop up from the delicious meal. The song was a classic, but the song playing was a cover version. But Joe wasn't paying attention. He wondered if Buddy and Kelly Huval knew what Angela was doing now. Buddy and Kelly had been good, Catholic parents, had been severely disappointed in their daughters marrying him, a divorced man. They had nearly disowned Angela over her divorce from him. Even after 4 kids, Angela Decker was still a slim pixie of a girl as she twisted and gyrated to Smooth Criminal by Alien Ant Farm. She still wore her brown hair in a symmetrical cut that framed her small face perfectly. In the harsh light, Joe couldn't see her cute little spattering of freckles across her cute little nose. He could see her cupid bow mouth. Joe could see her legs were still a little on the chubby side. Angela had always hated her thick legs. A customer dropped a bill into the tip jar and Angela gave the man a smile as she shimmied out of her lacy camisole top. 7 candidates, 5 positions. Who would you cut, Brian? Joe said, tearing his eyes away from his ex-wife. Can't cut Allison Harding, she's the only female on the list, Brian mused and smiled as the waitress put the pie slices in front of them. Darn, why all are not shy with the pie? Huh? Thomas praised as each wedge was a sizable chunk of goodness. Want why all coming back? The Asian girl smiled, Texas twang quite noticeable. While the 3 men hammered out their summer internship program, Heather Bro straddled the ottoman in Hurricane Room 3. She had seen her daddy out there, sitting at table 4. With his shaved head and blonde goatee, he was hard to miss. But before she could even get to his table, before Heather could hug her handsome daddy, the manager had let her know she had one waiting in Hurricane Room 3. She had seen Joe Gaudet sitting at table 4. He still looked good. His handsome face had a few more wrinkles. His hair, what was left of it, had a lot of gray in it, but he looked good. Dwayne Decker had been a running back in high school and had the body of a running back when she'd left Joe for him. Now Dwayne was a bloated, balding fool. His body was adorned with numerous prison tattoos. His once handsome face bore the scars of prison fights. Joe's words still hurt Angela. She's dumb enough to run off with you? I'm smart enough to let her. Joe had not even wanted to fight for her. 13 years after their divorce, Angela now understood why. Joe shouldn't have to fight for her. They promised each other to be loyal to each other, to honor, to cherish one another. But Dwayne had whined and persuaded Angela that she'd promised that she'd be his until the end of time. Well, now Dwayne was sitting in Bender lockup, most likely would be going back to Mumphrey, or possibly Angola, until the end of time. His tough defy authority attitude had seemed so cool in high school. Now, at 34 years old, that defy authority attitude was childish, self-defeating, and the supervisor at King Sanitation was threatening to sue the Deckers over his medical bills. Sue them for what? Angela didn't know. They were renting the trailer. The large flat-screen television Dwayne just had to have wasn't paid off yet. The one car may or may not start, depending on how cold it was. You know what, Dwayne? I'm done, jerk. I'm just done. Angela spat bitterly. As Angela was preparing to go back onto the small stage, Joe was riding his Harley past the St. Elizabeth Parish Trauma Center. He'd secured the land the Stonecrest condominiums had been scheduled to occupy and had sold that land to Paula Lambert for the proposed hospital site. The speculation homes that Keith and Kevin Blanchard had completed also became Joe's spec homes in the settlement against Keith's estate. Most of the homes he'd had torn down. Their construction was shoddy, their floor plans were poorly designed, poorly executed. And in 2009, when the lawsuit had finally wrapped up, The metal in the homes were worth more than the homes themselves. The land was worth more than the lumber and sheetrock and faux granite countertops. He cruised past a trailer park he owned. 4 of Keith's spec houses had once stood there. Joe shook his head sadly. He was getting ready to begin construction of a new grocery store on that property. The tenants of the trailer park should be getting their orders to vacate soon. Finally, he pulled up to his house. He'd had the garage door repainted a battleship gray, and the door, the overhang and the faux wooden shutters painted a brick red. Just before he pulled into the garage, he could see the bright collection of flowers in the flower box by the front door, most of them blooming beautifully in the late spring. Entering his kitchen, Joe saw that the message light was blinking on his digital recorder. "Hi, mister." Joe Glenda's cheerful voice made him smile. "I just finished my sociology finals. I'm pretty sure—" "No, I'm positive I aced it. I'm certain you did too," sweetheart, Joe said to the machine. "You're a smart girl." "Mister." "Joe? Gosh, I hope I did all right," Rudy's voice said. "But algebra's so hard. I don't know if I can be an engineer like you." "Hang in there, baby. Just hang in there," Joe encouraged the machine. "Hey, Joe, did another transfer to your account?" David's voice came on. "Oh gosh, David, told you. We're even now," Joe said. "Told you when they started college you're all caught up." "Anyway, we love you," David said. "Love you too," Joe agreed, and threw the sales announcement from Abdul's department store into the trash. Then he remembered and dug the papers out of the trash and dropped them into the small recycling bin. The digital recorder dinged and the second message started. "Hey, hi, gosh, can't believe you still got the same number. Hey, this is Angela." Joe paused as he heard his ex-wife's voice on the recorder. The end.